there anyone here who believes that for any reason Bernice and Peter should not be joined together here today in holy matrimony? Such a person should speak now or forever remain silent. Pastor James, the officiating minister, asked in a calm, steady voice. For a moment, the entire church held its breath. You could hear a pin drop. The air was thick with anticipation as every eye darted around the room, wondering if someone might actually stand up. Then, after about 5 seconds, but what had seemed as though the universe had stopped, Pastor James smiled and began again. By the power conferred on me, I now pronounce you. Suddenly, the church doors flew open with a loud bang before he could complete his sentence. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Heads turned around to see a young man, his face flushed with emotion, storming down the aisle. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the stunned congregation. "Bernice is my wife, and we have a child together. She cannot marry another man while she's still married to me," the young man shouted across. Everyone in the room froze. Some guests covered their mouths in shock, while others whispered hurriedly to their neighbors. Bernice's face turned pale, and Peter's expression shifted from joy to that of confusion. The sound of murmuring voices filled the air as everyone tried to make sense of what had just happened. Even Pastor James, who had been so composed a moment ago, stood speechless, his hands suspended in mid-air. Bernice's close friends and bridesmaids looked horrified, whilst Peter's parents exchanged shocked glances. Bernice's leg felt like they were about to give away as she stared at the man who had just disrupted such an important day for her. Kalu, the man she thought she had lost forever. He was supposed to be dead. How is this even possible? She thought, her head spinning. Peter leaned closer to Bernice. Who is this man? And what the hell is he talking about? He asked in a whisper. Tears welled up in Bernice's eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but found herself unable to form words. How could she explain all of this? How could she possibly tell Peter that the man she thought was dead was standing here alive in the middle of their wedding? Peter, seeing that Bernice was not giving him the quick response he desired, stepped forward, though still trying to maintain his composure. Who are you? He asked the young man. And what do you mean by she's still married to you? He asked. I am Kalu. Bernice is my wife. We were married 3 years ago and lived in the US until we came for a short visit to my parents here in Nigeria. We were on our way back from sightseeing one day when we got involved in an accident. I was in a coma for months, and then I woke up to find out that my supposed loving wife demanded a huge amount of money from my parents and abandoned me to die in the hospital. Kalu announced, his voice filled with rage. Everyone in the congregation gasped. The air in the church felt heavy. The guests were leaning forward, holding their breaths, watching as the tension grew. Some were shocked, others just curious about how the story would end. They wanted to know if what the young man, whom they've all now come to know as Kalu after he introduced himself, they wanted to know if what he had just said was true. They waited to see if Bernice would deny the man's claim. Peter, his patience clearly wearing thin, turned to Bernice, searching her face for answers. Is this true? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That is not true, Kalu. Bernice cursed through, finally able to find her voice and replying to Kalu's accusation, just as the congregation anticipated. I did not abandon you. I was told you died, she said defensively. Oh, really? You were told I died? And instead of mourning me at least as a loving wife would, you did rather demanded for a huge sum of money from my parents and walk away? Kalu fired back. I did not demand for the money. Your parents offered me the money, Bernice protested. But you accepted it. You accepted it, didn't you? Kalu fired again. Every one of his words was like a sharp sword piercing and cutting through Bernice's heart. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. She glanced at Peter, whose face had turned stone cold. Then she looked back at Kalu, her emotions in turmoil. The guests, meanwhile, were in complete disarray, whispering furiously amongst themselves, trying to piece together what has just been revealed. Pastor James cleared his throat, trying to bring the room back under control. Perhaps you should not talk about this privately. You can do so in my office, he suggested softly, pointing his hands towards the direction of his office. This could all be a misunderstanding. But again, before he could complete his sentence, Kalu cut in. This is no misunderstanding. It is not misunderstanding, Kalu interrupted him loudly. His tone was that of intense anger and agitation. It is not misunderstanding. Bernice here was obviously happy when she thought that I had died. It is so. Seeing that she demanded for money from my parents and went away and is now about to marry another man instead of mourning me, her husband, Kalu said. How could you, Bernice? How could you? You should have told me that you were not happy being my wife and would have demanded for a divorce from me instead of this, he said, still very angry. Stop it, Kalu. Just stop it. I won't have you accuse me of what I am not and what I did not do, Bernice said, her voice more firm now, even though tears were now streaming down her face. The air in the church felt very thick with tension. The guests were now on the edge of their seats, watching this real-life drama unfold before their eyes. Some looked on with pity, whilst others seemed to be enjoying the spectacle, hanging on every word exchange between Kalu and Bernice. Kalu, I think you should talk about this privately, just as Pastor James have suggested. A middle-aged white woman who had been in the congregation but had now stood up and came to the altar, said, addressing Kalu, her hand placed on his shoulder. Mrs. Rosaline? Kalu said in shock. So you are here also? He asked, his expression showing more disbelief and disappointment. Mrs. Rosaline was Bernice's course and project supervisor at the university in the US, where Bernice had had her first degree. Though their relationship was that of a student-lecturer relationship at the beginning, it went from a student-lecturer relationship and grew into that of a mentor and a mentee, eventually blossoming into a close friendship later on. Mrs. Rosaline was aware that Bernice and Kalu were married. As a matter of fact, she had also been in their wedding just as she is in this one now, and had also become a friend to Kalu. But just as Bernice, Mrs. Rosaline had also thought that Kalu died. She had flew into Nigeria to honor Bernice's invitation and grace her wedding with Peter. She had also been shocked when she saw Kalu appeared in the middle of the wedding few minutes earlier. But hearing all he said and all he accused Bernice of, Mrs. Rosaline could tell that there had been a huge misunderstanding and there was some foul play. And so, she had stood up to also address the situation. Kalu, I can tell this is all a huge misunderstanding and that there had been some foul play. I know that you are angry and disappointed and that you desperately want answers. But you cannot get the answer you so desperately seek if you handle this issue in the way you are right now. So, I also suggest that you both talk about this privately. Mrs. Rosaline stated again, urging Kalu to go into Pastor James's office and also beckoning on Bernice and Peter to do the same. Kalu, now a little calm, listened to Miss Rosaline. The whispers in the church grew louder again as the congregation watched Kalu, Bernice, and Peter make their way towards the direction of Pastor James's office. Majority of them wishing and wanting to see the end of the whole drama. Pastor James, feeling the situation, raised his hands, trying to restore order once again. Everyone, please calm down, calm down. On behalf of Peter and Bernice, I apologize for this interruption. I know you all had come to witness a wedding here today and not this. But as you can see, there is a misunderstanding here and this is an important issue which must be resolved. I indulge you to hang on if you can until we bring you information on the final decision of the parties involved. You can step out, walk around and take a break if need be, he said to the congregation. Slowly, some of the guests got up and walked out of the church, still whispering. Some going away to never return, while some to actually walk around and take a break as Pastor James had suggested, as they would love to see the end of the drama, but a few of them just because they only cared. Bernice and Kalu were once happily married. They had a quiet court wedding in the US 4 years ago. Kalu, who was a medical doctor and was based in the US, first met Bernice one day when he was on an official visit to an elderly patient's home where Bernice worked as the patient's caregiver. Bernice was an orphan and only child who had struggled most of her life while she was in Nigeria before she managed to get to the US and worked as a caregiver. Kalu and Bernice became friends, fell in love and later got married. They decided to travel to Nigeria months after their wedding so Kalu could introduce Bernice to his parents, who had only seen her in pictures and spoken to her on the phone. 8 days after their arrival in Nigeria, tragedy struck. On their way back from a museum trip, Bernice and Kalu were involved in a terrible car accident. They were both rushed to the hospital where Bernice stayed unconscious for a whole month. When she finally woke up, Kalu was nowhere to be found. Instead, it was his mother who came to her with the heartbreaking news. Kalu did not survive the accident. He died and we have already buried him, Kalu's mother told Bernice coldly. Bernice's word came crashing down. She begged to be taken to Kalu's grave, but his mother refused. Instead, Kalu's mother handed Bernice a large sum of money and actually told her to go away from them. We never liked you. We didn't want our son to marry you. We wanted our son to marry a girl befitting for him, not some low-life house girl or caregiver who managed to have some unworthy, useless degree. You brought bad luck to our son, and now look, he is dead because of you. So go far away from us, Kalu's mother said harshly to Bernice. Bernice pleaded that she be taken to Kalu's grave and be allowed to stay to mourn her husband. But Kalu's parents kicked her out of their house and threw the money they had offered her at her face. Bernice did not leave immediately. She had stayed at their gates, crying and banging on the gates for them to show to her husband's grave and be allowed to mourn her husband. She slept outside by the gate the whole of that night in the cold, but Kalu's parents had instructed their gatekeeper not to open the gates nor allow Bernice into their compound. Crushed and heartbroken, Bernice took the money and left the next morning. But she did not return to the US. Instead, she went to Lagos, to where she used to stay with an old friend when she was still struggling and hawking fruits before she had gone to the US. She was pregnant with Kalu's child. Kalu knew about the baby before the accident, but now, with him gone, Bernice knew she would have to raise their child on her own and had chosen to do it in Nigeria, their homeland, and where she felt close to Kalu. Mrs. Roslin had asked her to return to the US, but Bernice had stubbornly refused. But Kalu had not died. He too had been in a coma, unconscious for 11 long weeks after the accident. His parents, who secretly never approved of Bernice and had wished for Kalu to marry one Miss Ifoma, who was the daughter of their friend and business partner, moved Kalu to a different hospital while he was still unconscious. When he finally woke up, they lied to him. Bernice is gone, his mother told him. She demanded for a large amount of money from us and returned to the US. She did not even care to stay by your side, his mother told him. Kalu's heart broke. He couldn't believe that the woman he loved had abandoned him in his darkest moments. Unwilling at first to believe what his mother had told him, Kalu had tried to find Bernice. He traveled back to the US but discovered that Bernice did not return, and somehow he could not find any details about her, nor her whereabouts. He tried to contact Mrs. Roslin, knowing that Mrs. Roslin would know Bernice's whereabouts. But Mrs. Roslin had been on a sacred pilgrimage at the time, and so he was unable to reach her also. Hot, angry, and believing that his mother was right about Bernice, Kalu chose to move on with his life and so relocated from the US to Canada. 3 years passed and Kalu had no idea where Bernice was. But one day, his colleague at the hospital he works in Canada told him that he wanted to travel to Nigeria because his cousin was getting married. He showed Kalu a photo of his cousin's pre-wedding photographs, and that was when Kalu saw the bride and recognized that the bride was Bernice. Not only that, Kalu learned from his colleague that Bernice had a young son around 2 or 3 years old. Kalu's mind raced. He did the maths and realized the boy could only be his because he remembered that Bernice was pregnant at the time of their accident. What if the pregnancy was even never mine, Kalu had thought. Determined to get answers and ready to fight for the custody of the child if it was his, Kalu, without telling his colleague, also planned and flew back to Nigeria to confront Bernice. But now, sitting face to face with each other in Pastor James's office, and both of them having heard the other side of the story, Kalu was left with no option, which is to confront his parents about the truth. Bernice had been devastated after she was told that Kalu had died. She had been so heartbroken and had felt that there was nothing more to live for. But she had decided to strengthen herself for her unborn baby, Kalu's seed which grew in her. Life meant nothing to her after she was told Kalu died, so she cut all form of social media and communicated less. Only Mrs. Roslin fought to keep in touch with her. She opened a mini provision and beverage store with the money Kalu's parents had given to her after she had a baby, whom she named Kalu Jr. And then one day, she met Peter, who was first one of her customers and later became close as he was fond of Junior Kalu and called the little boy his friends. Later, Peter proposed marriage to Bernice, and though Bernice had outrightly refused at first, she eventually accepted for the sake of Junior Kalu, as everyone around her had advised and encouraged her to. Please forgive us, my son, for lying to you. We told the lie to separate you and Bernice because we do not like her and had hoped that you would accept to marry Ifeoma, Kalu's parents said when Kalu confronted them and insisted on the truth. Seeing Bernice standing beside him and with the scary gaze of Peter, Mrs. Roslin, and Peter's cousin who had come with Kalu and Bernice to his parents' house, his parents had no choice but to confess to the truth. After learning the truth from his parents, Kalu turned to Bernice. I am sorry I judged and despised you all these years. I had thought that you actually abandoned me, he said, pleading with Bernice. With the truth which had now come to light, Bernice could not help herself as tears flowed freely down her face. She had mourned her husband for over 2 years, believing he had died. She had suffered heartache and made to raise her son all by herself. She knew it was not Kalu's fault, as he was also a victim of his parents' cruelty and mischief. But She could not open her mouth to speak or respond to Kalu's plea for forgiveness. "I wish to be alone for now," was all she could say amidst a sob. Kalu, though desperate for her forgiveness, understood how she felt. Peter, though hurt himself, but being a loving and an understanding man also, could understood Bernice's pain. So, the two men caught in this web decided to give Bernice some time alone to herself, as she requested, with Mrs. Roslyn and Mary, who is Bernice's flatmate, friend and maid of honor, to watch over her. Bernice locked herself in her room for 2 days and cried her eyes out. Thank God for Mrs. Roslyn, who helped her and took care of Kalu Jr. On the evening of the 3rd day, Bernice felt okay and decided to see and speak with Peter first. "I am sorry, Peter. I didn't plan for things to happen the way it did," she said. Peter smiled warmly and held her hands. "Though I was hurt, but I completely understand now. You had no fault in all that happened," he replied. There was a moment of silence. Then Peter spoke again. "I have also had time to think, and though it hurts, I will understand if you still wish to be married to Kalu. I would rather remain your friend and have a good cordial relationship with you, instead of insisting that you marry me if you do not want to do so. So, tell me, do you still love Kalu and wish to be with him?" Peter asked. Bernice hesitated for a while and then slowly nodded her head to show what her answer was. She still loves Kalu and would want to be with him. "I accept your decision, and what is of utmost importance to me is that you are happy," Peter said. Then Kalu came out from where he had been hiding and had been waiting for the right time. He went on his knees before Bernice and spoke. "Thank you, Bernice. Thank you for giving me another chance at being your husband again," he said. Bernice pulled him up and they gave each other a tight hug, after which Kalu thanked Peter for letting him have his wife back. A week after that, Kalu took his wife and son, Junior Kalu, and they flew back to Canada. He told his parents never to contact him or ever look for him again, but promised that he would send them money regularly for their upkeep through a welfare agency for the aged and elderly, which he did. Peter also found love again a year later and got married. They all lived happily ever after. The end. I hope you enjoyed this story and I believe that you learned something from it. Share with me in the comment section if you did. Thank you for watching and see you in my next story. Bye.